Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn all about functions. This is an extremely crucial thing, so make sure you fully understand everything in this lecture. So functions are another core concept in programming. A function is basically putting some code inside a box. So let's say over here we've got a bunch of code. This is all in just one main function. This is our entire program, but instead we can build like this. We basically put some code in a separate box, so this is going to be our function. And then we can easily call that function, meaning run the code inside that box by just calling one line of code. One big benefit of this is simply organization. Our code becomes much easier to understand if we have some clear functions with some clear names that do one very specific thing. That is much better for organization as opposed to having a giant wall of text for your entire program. Another big benefit is how it cuts down on copy-pasted code. Without functions, we would need to write the function code every time we wanted that behavior. So for example, let's say here we got some code that we are copy-pasting and repeating 3 times. Right away, it's bad that we are copy-pasting the same code multiple times. But even worse than that is imagine if we wanted to modify some behavior on this code that we are repeating multiple times. In order to modify it, we need to apply those modifications to every single version, every single place where we are calling essentially the same code. Whereas if we're using a function, it doesn't matter how many times we call it. If we need to modify anything in this logic, we just modify it in one place and automatically updates in every other place. Also, just one quick note, like I've said several times, code runs from top to bottom, and that is still true when it comes to functions, except the code jumps around a little bit. So it starts executing up here, executes all these, then gets to the function, and then it jumps inside the function, then it runs the code top to bottom from that function, and when it reaches the end, basically goes back and continues executing from there. So the execution jumps around a bit, but it's still pretty much the same in terms of working from top to bottom. And now before we see the syntax for functions, we should look into the other more advanced template. So far we've been using this really basic template where we just write our code here. This is really great for the basics, but by now we already have enough knowledge to be able to use the more thorough template. So go ahead and open up Visual Studio, then let's go to create a brand new project. Once again, let's pick a console app. You should be able to see it on the recent project templates, or again, search for it. And again, remember it's this one with the C# icon. It is not the one with Visual Basic or F#, and it is not the one with .NET Framework. It is the one that just says console app in C#. So let's pick this one. Then let's give it some name. I'm going to go with Code Monkey C# course. Place it anywhere and leave it the same solution name. Let's go next. Then over here, yep, let's use .NET 8. And importantly is over here, let's make sure to tick this box. We do not want to use the top level statements, which is the simplified template. We don't want to use that. We want to use the standard code. So that's it, just like this. Let's hit on create. And yep, here is the brand new template. For now, you really don't need to worry about the specifics of this. So don't worry about what is a namespace, what is a class, what is static, and so on. For now, you can ignore all of that. Just know that the only difference in this template is all the code that we've been writing. Right now, we would simply write it directly in here inside the main function. If we run this, we should see the exact same hello world. Yep, there it is, hello world, exactly the same as previously. The one very important thing is here being very careful over where you write your code, meaning it needs to be over here inside the main function, inside this code block. It cannot be, for example, over here just inside the class code block. This does not work, this causes an error. And it also cannot be outside here, inside namespace, or completely outside of anything. So all the syntax is all still exactly the same as we've been seeing so far. Just make sure to write it over here directly inside the main function. And now before we see the syntax instead of function, those are usually referring to the exact same thing. Technically in C# the correct term is method, but both terms are really used interchangeably. Sometimes I call them functions, sometimes I call them methods. Just know that in most cases when someone says either term, they're really referring to the same thing. Now in order to define a function, we begin writing, let's say, outside the main function. Again, it's very important that you write the code in the correct place. We want to start writing over here, which is after closing the main code block, but still inside the class code block. So inside this one, but outside the main. So right here, we begin by defining the data type that we're going to return from that function. If we don't want to return any data, we can use a special type called void. Void means nothing, so pretty much exactly the same thing as our main function here, which also does not return anything. So we have the return type, and then we give the function some kind of name. I'm actually going to talk about the importance of good names later on in the course in a dedicated lecture. It is an extremely important thing. You should always give it a proper name and not something that has no meaning, like for example just the letter X. If you do that, then you have no idea what that is actually doing. So over here, let's give it a proper name. Let's say we want to make a function that just prints hello to the console. So let's give it a proper name and just call it say hello. So that's the name of our function, and then we open our parentheses, and inside we add any parameters that we want our function to have. Although optionally, we can also have it with no parameters. So let's just close the parentheses. Again, always keep in mind matching opening and closing. So we define this, and then we just write our code block. So just curly braces, open and close, and yep, over here we have the function code. Now here we can write whatever code we want our function to do. So for example, let's just do a simple console.writeLine, and let's just print out hello. Alright, yep, that's it. Pretty simple. Here we have defined a function. Also, just one more thing. In order for our demo to work, we actually need to mark this function as static. So over here, we need to write static, just like we have on the main. Now, like I said a while ago, for now, don't worry about understanding static. I will cover it in detail later on in the course. For now, just know that in order for our code to work, we need both the main function and the sayHello function. We need both of these to be marked as static. Okay, so our function is ready. However, if we try running this, and if we still just see hello world, we do not see our second function hello. That's because over here we are defining the function, but we didn't actually run it. Remember how code executes? It executes from top to bottom, and the entry point is over here inside the main function. So right now, all our program is doing is it starts executing over here, then runs this one, prints hello world onto the console, and it reaches the end of the main function, and that closes our program. So just defining a function doesn't actually do anything. We need to actually call it or run that function. And in order to do that, we just need to write our function name. So let's say hello, and then the parentheses for any parameters, which in this one doesn't have any. So let's just open and close. And again, terminate our instruction with a semicolon. Also, again, very important, remember how code is case sensitive. So you have to write the name of the function exactly. If I replace this age with a lowercase h, nope, does not work. At a red squiggly line, needs to be perfect. If I replace the s with s, nope, does not work. So always remember code is case sensitive. So just with this, if we test, and yep, we do see hello world and then hello. So basically, like I showed in the diagram, the code is running from top to bottom, so starts executing here, then goes to execute this one, which in turn causes the execution to jump onto this one, and when this function terminates, then it goes back into the original execution, which in turn simply finishes the program. Another extremely useful thing about functions is simply how you can call them as many times as you want. So for example, let's make a bunch more instructions over here. Let's print out hello vertically. Okay, just like this. Now let's say we wanted to print this out 3 times. So we could either copy paste the code literally 3 times, but obviously this looks quite messy, or using functions, we can simply call the function 3 times. And if we test, and if there it is, it did run our function, did run our print 3 times. And also, like I mentioned in the diagram, if we wanted to modify any behavior inside this function, we just need to modify it over here just once in the function, and basically automatically updates whatever that function is called, as opposed to if we were copy pasting, we would need to make that modification multiple times. So just with this simple example, we can already see a ton of benefits from functions. They help us organize our code by splitting our code into functions that each do a specific thing, and also helps us avoid tons of copy pasted code by putting any code we want inside a function and simply calling it. Now that we've seen the super basic function, next thing are parameters. And the way you add parameters is inside the parentheses. Parameters are essentially just variables, so we start by writing the data type for the parameter. Let's say we want one of type string, so we just write string. Then we give it some kind of name, so let's say player name. Again, make sure you choose good names that clearly represent what this parameter should be, what it should represent. And now basically inside this function, we can use our player name in any way you want. So for example, let's say hello and then print out the player name. All right, yep, just like this. And now up here, we can already see a bunch of errors. And the error is saying there is no argument given, which also, by the way, you might hear the name argument instead of parameter. These are again, sort of interchangeable names, just like method and function. Now, technically the definition is that over here, when defining the function, this one is technically called a parameter, whereas when you use it to call something, that one is technically called an argument. So that's what's technically correct, but in reality, most people use both terms interchangeably, so parameter or argument really refers to the same thing. And now here we can see the error, and the error says that there is no argument given that corresponds to the required parameter for our player name. So inside the parameters, we need to pass in a string for our player name. We can either pass in a variable, so define a string variable and pass it in, or just write over here a string directly. So let's say code monkey, and yep, just like this, and if we test, and yep, it does say hello code monkey, which of course means that you can call the function multiple times with multiple different parameters, and yep, it runs the logic with multiple parameters. And speaking of multiple, we can also have more than one over here. We've already seen 0 parameters and 1 parameter, but we can have as many as we want. You really just add a comma and then again, any type of name. Well, let's say int age, like hello player name, you are age years old. Then over here on say hello, just pass in another parameter just like this. And if there it is, hello code monkey, you are 35 years old. The next very important thing about functions are return types. Right now we define this function as returning void, and void means nothing, so it means that this function doesn't return anything. But now let's make a function that does return something. Let's make a function to simply add 2 numbers together. To get the result, let's play just around with simple whole numbers. So let's put int. We're going to return an int. Let's call it add numbers. Then inside parentheses, let's add 2 numbers. So let's define int x, int y, Okay, like this, and right away Visual Studio is showing us an error, and it says not all code paths return a value, meaning if we define some kind of return type other than void, we have to return something. And the way we do that is simply with the keyword return, and then whatever value we want to return. So in this case, adding two numbers, let's just do x plus y. And yep, there it is, super simple. Again, in order to call this, we need to add in static, just make sure that it works. And now up here, now we can call add numbers. Let's add the number 1 and 2, and let's see. Let's actually put this inside a console.writeLine just to see the result. Okay, let's test. And yep, there it is. The result is indeed 3, so 1 plus 2 equals 3. Another thing you can do is define multiple functions with the exact same name. They just need to have different parameters, either a different number of parameters or different types. So here we cannot define another function named exactly add numbers with also 2 int parameters. We cannot do this, but if we swap one of these into bool, then all of a sudden this function definition is indeed valid. Or alternatively, if we have int, but then we have a final one. If we do, then yep, this one is also valid. And then up here, when calling add numbers, as soon as you open the parentheses, you see this one and you see 1 of 2. So this is basically showing all the various versions of this function. So the first version takes an x and a y, both ints. And the second version takes x, y, and z. And for the types, we can just look inside the console.writeLine, so add the parentheses. And over here we see this one has 18 versions. So this one takes no parameters. This one takes a boolean, a character array, decimal, double, float, and so on. And then of course you can also chain functions together. So basically the return value, this means that whenever this function runs, it is going to run this logic and return some kind of thing. So just like we saw on the ifs and the conditions, basically the code gets to here, evaluates this function, gets some kind of return value. So for example, up here, instead of passing in number 35, we can call add numbers and pass in something. As long as the return type on this function matches the parameter type, as long as it's like that, then yep, this works. If there it is, that's correct. And of course, we can simply put the result of a function inside some kind of variable. So int number, we can just add numbers. And now if we do a console.writeLine on our number, if we do this, if there it is, it does print the same thing. Now, one very useful type to return from a function is boolean. So for example, let's make another function. Let's make it return bool. And let's say for example, just is positive. We want to return if a certain number is positive. Let's receive an int x. And we can do if and compare x to 2. So if x is bigger than or equal to 0, I think 0 equals as a positive number. I'm not sure, but I think so. So if so, then this return true. And if not, then return false. And yep, there it is. And again, just in here, we need to make sure to add static in order to make this work. So now up here, let's do a console.writeLine. And let's pass in is positive. Let's say the number 5. Then let's add a semicolon, just separate it. And let's say is positive. And let's say -2. Okay, let's see what this does. And yep, it says true and false. So yep, that is correct. 5 is indeed positive. -2 is indeed not positive. Also, by the way, here, instead of doing these returns, instead of doing these ifs, instead we can really just return the condition itself. So we can just do return and just return the condition. So just like this. And yep, everything still works exactly the same. When the code gets to here, it is going to evaluate this condition, which is going to return true or false, and then returns the whole thing and then prints it out. Now back over here on the void return type, on this one, you don't have to call return. Over here, we have no errors. However, if you want, you can also call return. And for this one, since this returns nothing, it returns no type. Instead of calling return, then passing in some value, we just call return, then semicolon. That's it. Basically, what this will do is it will stop the execution of the function directly at this point. So Visual Studio actually helps us. As you can see, this line is in a dark gray. And that is because, like it says here, unreachable code detected. Since we are always calling return over here, then this line of code will never ever run. Speaking of functions and parameters, this is also a great type to see how things work with regards to value types versus reference types. This is something that I cover in detail later on in the intermediate section, but I want to make a quick mention up here. For example, let's keep just the say hello. So let's actually get rid of all these. Okay. So let's say I define an int for the age, and let's say I put it at something, and then I call say hello, and then let's put the exact same thing. So that and pass in the age. And now over here inside the say hello, let's do age plus plus. So basically we are incrementing the value of age. So when this line of code runs, instead of printing 35, it should print 36. But now the important thing is now out here, let's say we print out the age again. So writeLine on the age. So let's print this one out. And now let's see what this one says. And if there it is. So inside the function, it says you are 36 years old, but outside the function, it says 35. Basically what is happening is when we call a function, over here when we pass in a parameter, when we do that, we're actually passing in a copy of the value stored inside this variable. So when we increment the variable in here, we are really just incrementing the copy, and we are not actually modifying the original value. That is why when we run here, we see 36, because we are working with this copy that we did modify. But when we exit the function and we run this line of code, when we do that, we are using the original piece of data which has not been modified. Again, this has to do with the fact that some types, like int, those are passed in as copies, meaning that the function receives a copy of the original value, And if you modify that inside the function, you are modifying the copy and not the original value. And then there are other types, which are reference types, which is going to have some different behavior. Those are passed in as a reference instead of a copy. So for those, if you modify them inside the function, then you will also modify them outside the function. Now, if you're a bit confused, don't worry. Like I said, I talk about in detail about value types versus reference types. I talk about what they are and what that actually means later on in the intermediate section. Right now, I really just want you to be aware of that difference. When working, for example, with primitive types, like over here, the int, when you pass it in, always remember you are working with a copy. So just be aware that if you modify something inside a function, it will not necessarily modify it outside the function. Alright, so here we'll learn another really crucial thing about programming, functions. They are extremely powerful and you will be writing tons of functions with all sort of return types and all sort of number of parameters. So definitely do make sure you fully understand functions before going any further. Watch this lecture a second time if you need to, they are really that crucial. And now that we have introduced functions, which allows us to have multiple separated code blocks, because of that you should really learn the basics of variable scope, so let's learn that in the next lecture.